Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're tackling a pretty intense topic, honor violence narratives.
Mm.
Specifically, we're looking at how these stories are told in Denmark.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. It goes beyond just storytelling, though. It's
Okay.
really about how these narratives end up shaping public understanding of such a complex issue.
Okay, so to really get into this, we're going to be looking at Martyr Kærlighed og voldsofri.pdf. It's this academic article that analyzes two autobiographies written by women who have experienced honor-related violence.
Right, we're going deeper than just the headlines,
Yeah.
getting a first-hand perspective on things.
Exactly. The first book is Era's Drab, which translates to Honor Killing by Sengül Jefferseal. It was published in 2003, and it recounts her experience as a Danish-Turkish woman whose family actually murdered her boyfriend back in 1985.
Wow, it's a really stark look at what can happen when those cultural expectations clash with individual choices.
Right. And the second autobiography is Nor Blood Bliver Tinder in Vand, When Blood Becomes Thinner Than Water. That one was published in 2005, and it's by Sandra Birkin, a Danish-Moroccan woman who was forced into a marriage when she was only 13 years old.
So both of these stories really give us like an inside view into the lives of women who are facing huge pressure from their families and cultures.
So the big question that we're really trying to get at today is, how do these very personal stories actually end up shaping how people in Denmark see and understand honor violence?
Hmm.
And then what can we learn from the way that these women tell their stories?
Right. We're going to be looking at how those individual experiences, those stories, can actually shine a light on those big social issues, and also how these narratives, can influence what the public thinks about honor violence.
Okay, so it's almost like we're zooming in on a tiny detail to get a better understanding of the whole picture.
Yeah, exactly. And, the article starts off by talking about the power of narratives. It says that sharing those personal experiences can actually be a way for victims to heal. It allows them to, like, process their trauma and also find meaning, in what they've gone through.
It's almost like they're turning pain into power.
Yeah, and these narratives can do even more than just personal healing. They can actually challenge those dominant narratives that are already out there, giving a voice to those groups that are often marginalized.
So they're really like flipping the script.
Exactly,
All
flipping
right.
the script.
Yeah.
So let's dive into Sengül's story. She talks about her early life in Denmark, arriving from Turkey with her family. She experienced violence from her father, and she was forced into engagements and even a marriage.
It's just crazy. It really highlights how little control women in these situations have over their own lives.
Yeah, it is. It's a recurring theme for sure. The article focuses on one event in particular, though, a really pivotal event. She had an arranged meeting with her boyfriend Hassan's family. It was supposed to be like a step towards marriage, but it ended up becoming a planned honor killing.
Oh my gosh. That's just horrifying.
It is. And to make things even worse, Sengül was forced to actually take part in the murder of Hassan. Her father's plan was to basically use her as an alibi by claiming that Hassan had raped her.
Wow, that's chilling. It's scary how perpetrators can manipulate the system like that to try and hide their crimes.
Yeah, and thankfully Sengül eventually testified against her parents. This led to their convictions.
It's such a powerful example of someone breaking free from being silenced and demanding justice.
Yeah.
So we've talked about Sengül's story. What about Sandra's story?
Sandra's story is equally gripping. She talks about immigrating from Morocco to Denmark with her family. She was a victim of sexual abuse from her brother, and she ended up being married off to her cousin in Morocco when she was only 13.
Yeah. Child marriage is a really serious human rights violation, and we see it so often intertwined with these cultural practices and societal pressures. It's a very complex issue with some long-lasting consequences. But Sandra persevered.
She did. She came back to Denmark and she decided to get an education. Her family wasn't very happy about it. They resisted. But she kept going, and she eventually divorced her husband.
There's this detail that I found really moving in her story. She actually changed her name from Sidika to Sandra, and she talks about it representing this conscious decision to kind of embrace Danish society, not
Yeah.
to break away from her past.
Yeah, I mean, names have a lot of weight culturally and personally, so changing her name was a powerful way of her reclaiming her identity.
Right. It's almost like a symbolic rebirth. So we've heard these two stories, and now I think we should get into analyzing the narratives themselves. The article uses this term, stories told from below, which I think is a really interesting way to put it. It emphasizes how the voices of these women are coming from these marginalized groups and how their stories challenge those traditional narratives. Those traditional narratives are often told from a very male perspective.
It's definitely about changing who has the power to tell the story. It's
Yeah.
about whose perspective is valued and considered valid.
It's about giving a voice to those who have been silenced. And one thing that I notice is that both stories have this kind of like a Romeo and Juliet kind of plot line going on. We see forbidden love and then tragic consequences. And I think that really resonates with readers and helps them get a deeper understanding of honor violence and how complex it is.
It's a narrative that people are familiar with. That structure, it uses those universal themes of love and conflict and tragedy, so it makes the story more relatable, more emotionally engaging for the reader.
Right. It's like a literary hook that just pulls you in. And then the article also digs into this really interesting argument about something they call the martyr theme.
Hmm.
It argues that these women are often portrayed as sacrificing their happiness or even their lives for the sake of being able to integrate into Danish society.
Yeah. It's an interesting point, and it raises a really important question about whether or not these narratives might be unintentionally reinforcing this idea that Danish values are superior.
Like it's subtly saying that integration comes at a really, really huge price.
Right. It raises all these questions about the complexities of cultural integration and the potential for bias, even when a story is trying to empower.
Exactly. So let's talk about some of the broader implications of these narratives. The article talks about how these types of stories can actually impact how the Danish public perceives honor violence.
It's kind of a double-edged sword. I mean, raising awareness is super important, but there's also a risk of framing honor violence as something that's solely rooted in quote-unquote foreign cultures.
Right. It's like an us versus them mentality, and that can be dangerous.
It is. It's important to remember that violence against women is a global issue, and we can't be using cultural practices as a way to excuse it or justify it.
Right. So it's about finding that balance between being sensitive to cultural differences, but also making sure that universal human rights are upheld.
Absolutely. And, the article also mentions this idea of a credibility barometer.
A credibility barometer. Interesting.
Yeah. It argues that these stories, by conforming to already established narratives about honor violence, they might actually make it easier for victims to be believed and get support.
That's kind of a tough one. So on one hand, fitting into that expected narrative might help victims get the help they need.
Right. But on the other hand, it can reinforce those harmful stereotypes and maybe make victims feel like they have to fit their experiences into this predetermined box to be taken seriously.
That's a really tough spot to be in. The article briefly points out something really important. There's a real lack of a feminist perspective in these popular narratives.
Yeah, that is a crucial observation. If we don't look at honor violence through a feminist lens, then we really miss the bigger context, the bigger picture of
Yeah.
violence against women.
Right? It's like we're missing a key piece of the puzzle. The feminist perspective would highlight all those social factors, all those systemic factors that are contributing to all kinds of gender-based violence, regardless of anyone's culture.
That's right. It's about understanding that patriarchy and gender inequality are really at the root of all violence against women. Cultural practices are often just another way that those deeper issues come out.
So we need to broaden the conversation, look at the bigger picture, and see the connections between all these different forms of oppression.
You got it.
So we need to broaden the conversation, look at the bigger picture, and see the connections between all these different forms of oppression.
Exactly.
Now, let's look at how these narratives are actually constructed. The article points out that Sengel and Sandra use some really similar techniques in their books.
Right. It's kind of fascinating how they both draw the readers in, and convey how weighty their experiences really are.
Yeah. So how do they do that?
Well, one technique they use is what we call emotive narratives.
Okay. What does that mean? Are they just trying to, like, make the reader cry?
Not necessarily cry, but definitely feel things very deeply. It's
Yeah.
about using strong imagery and vivid language, personal details, to create this really strong emotional response in whoever's reading it. Like, think about the part in Sengel's book when she describes being forced to undergo a virginity test.
Oh, yeah, that was really tough to read. It definitely stayed with me.
Exactly. I mean, that's a perfect example of emotive narrative. It's very graphic and disturbing, and it's designed to make you feel that humiliation and the violation that she experienced.
Right.
And these emotive narratives, they're not just there for shock value, though. There's a real purpose behind them.
So what's the purpose?
They help the reader connect with the writer on a personal level. It's not just reading facts, you're experiencing the world through the eyes of someone who has lived through these horrors.
Yeah, it makes you pay attention.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
And that emotional connection is key. It makes the reader so much more receptive to the message that the writer is trying to get across.
So it's about making the reader care.
Exactly. Another technique that both of the books use is incorporating familiar tropes and archetypes.
Like what?
Well, remember how we talked about the whole Romeo and Juliet plotline? That's a classic trope, a familiar story structure that taps into those universal themes of love, conflict, and tragedy.
So they're making their stories relatable to a wider audience by using tropes that people already understand.
Exactly. They're using existing cultural frameworks, things that readers already understand, so that makes the message a lot easier to grasp.
So it's almost like a shortcut to understanding.
Right. And then there's that martyr theme, which the article really points out. It's a really powerful element in both narratives.
Yeah, we talked about that a bit earlier, but I think it's worth breaking it down further. What makes this martyr theme so significant?
It's a theme with a lot of layers to it. On the one hand, it portrays the narrator as a victim, someone who has suffered a lot because they dared to challenge cultural norms.
Like they're paying the ultimate price for their freedom and autonomy.
Right. And that portrayal, it creates this sense of sympathy in the reader. Outrage, It really makes them question how unjust the situation is.
It's like a call for justice.
Yeah, but here's where things get a little, a little tricky. On the other hand, that martyr theme can subtly reinforce this idea that Danish values are somehow better, superior.
How so?
Well, by framing the narrator as a martyr, someone who is suffering for embracing Danish ideals, it kind of suggests that those ideals are worth dying for.
So it's like Danish culture is the ultimate goal, the best.
Exactly. And that can be a little problematic, it creates a hierarchy of cultures, and it puts Danish culture right at the top.
Yeah. Even if it's unintentional, it's still a form of cultural imperialism.
It is. We got to be aware of that when we're analyzing these narratives. We can admire their courage, the resilience of these women, without falling into that trap of thinking that one culture is somehow better than another.
It's a fine line to walk, but it's an important one.
Absolutely. That's why being critical, critical analysis is so important. We have to unpack these narratives and really look for those underlying messages. Engage with them thoughtfully.
Right. We need to be aware of potential biases and try to understand how complex these issues really are.
Exactly. And recognize that these narratives are just one part of a much, much bigger picture. They give us valuable insight, but they don't tell the whole story.
So they're like a starting point for a much deeper conversation.
Exactly.
And that conversation needs to include a variety of different voices and perspectives, especially from people within the communities that are affected by honor violence.
Yeah, for sure.
We can't settle for these oversimplified explanations. We need to acknowledge how complex this issue really is.
I agree. And work together to find solutions that promote respect and equality and justice for everyone.
Well said. Now, the article also explores the impact of these narratives on public perception, saying that these stories, while they do raise awareness, they can also reinforce harmful stereotypes.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that even stories that have really good intentions can have unintended consequences.
So it's a cautionary tale about the importance of responsible storytelling.
Right. And a reminder that we need to be aware of the potential pitfalls and always, approach these narratives with a critical eye.
What are some of those risks we should be watching out for?
Well, one risk is that we might overgeneralize about entire cultures based on the actions of just a few individuals.
Right. It's like painting an entire community with a broad brush that's never fair or accurate.
It isn't. And it can lead to prejudice and discrimination, even violence.
It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, where negative expectations lead to negative outcomes.
It is. Another risk is that we might get too focused on the cultural aspects of honor violence, and then we ignore the wider context of violence against women in general.
It's like seeing the trees, but missing the whole forest.
That's a good way to put it. Honor violence isn't just a cultural phenomenon. It's a symptom of so much deeper societal problems like patriarchy and gender inequality and these power imbalances.
But if we just focus on culture, then we're not addressing the root causes.
Exactly. And that means the solutions won't be effective. They won't address the real problems.
Right, like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound.
Exactly. We have to address the systemic and the societal factors that contribute to violence against women, no matter the culture, no matter the background.
It's about recognizing that violence against women is a human rights issue. not just a cultural one.
Absolutely. And that's why including a feminist perspective in these conversations is so, so important.
Right. A feminist lens would help us see all those connections between honor violence and all the other kinds of gender-based violence out there.
Exactly. It would help us understand all those power dynamics that are at play here and how things like patriarchy and misogyny, how they fuel all violence against women.
It's about looking at the bigger picture, the whole system, and coming up with solutions that address the root causes of inequality and injustice.
Exactly.
Now, I know we've covered a lot, but I just want to really reiterate the power that personal narratives have in shaping our understanding of really complex issues like honor violence. These stories can create empathy, understanding, and action.
Yeah, they're way more than just anecdotes, They're tools for social change.
And it's on us as listeners and members of society to engage with those narratives,
Yeah.
but to do it critically and thoughtfully.
It's about acknowledging how complex and nuanced things are and about using these stories to start a real dialogue, a dialogue that leads to some real and positive change.
Right. We can't just consume these narratives. We have to work to change the systems that allow this violence and this injustice to just, keep going. Now, something that the article discusses that I think is really interesting is this idea of silencing women. Both of the stories touch on this, and it's really striking.
Yeah. It's almost as if their voices are trapped, by those expectations, the cultural expectations and pressure from family.
Right. It's like they're being told to just bury their needs and their desires, just get rid of them.
Exactly. And that silencing, it's not just a cultural tradition, It's a very deliberate tactic to control women, to subjugate them.
Hmm.
And by denying them a voice, by trying to make them invisible, those people who are in power, they get to stay in power. They don't have to worry about people challenging the status quo.
Yeah. It's about power and control, plain and simple.
Exactly. And that silencing, it has some really devastating consequences. It makes women feel isolated and powerless and vulnerable. It keeps them from getting help, from connecting with other people, and from building a support system, a system they need to be able to escape those abusive situations.
Right. It's almost like they're trapped in this cage of silence, where their suffering and their pain is completely hidden.
It is. It is. And often that silencing, it gets even worse because of the fear of shame and stigma.
Yeah. There's so much pressure on women to protect the honor of their family,
Yeah.
even if that means sacrificing their own happiness and their safety.
Exactly. And that fear of shame, it can be paralyzing. It can stop women from speaking out, from seeking justice, and from taking back their own lives.
It's like a weapon that's used against them, another tool for oppression.
That's right. That's right. And we need to actively fight against it. We need to create a culture where victims actually feel safe, safe to tell their stories, their truth, without worrying about judgment or retaliation.
It's about giving women the power to break free from the silence, to reclaim their voices, and to finally demand justice.
Absolutely. These narratives also show us how complicated the relationship between culture and violence can be.
Yeah. It can be a really touchy subject, controversial, but we can't avoid talking about it.
You're right. You're right. We need to acknowledge that culture does shape our attitudes and behaviors, but we also have to avoid making blanket statements about entire cultures based on the actions of a few individuals.
It's about finding that balance between understanding how much influence culture has,
Yeah.
but also holding people accountable for their actions.
Exactly. We have to avoid making these huge judgments about whole communities while also recognizing that some cultural practices can contribute to harmful gender norms and power imbalances.
So it's not about saying that everyone from a particular culture is okay with violence against women.
It isn't. It's about understanding that culture is complex. It's
Mhm.
constantly evolving and changing, and it can be a source of strength, but it can also be a source of oppression.
Right. And it's about recognizing that everyone, individuals, we have the power to challenge those harmful cultural norms and work towards positive change.
Absolutely.
Now, one of the key takeaways from both of these narratives is the importance of intersectionality. I think a lot more people are familiar with that term, but can you remind our listeners what that means?
Sure, intersectionality is a framework for understanding how all the different parts of a person's identity, things like their gender, their race, their social class, and their religion, how they all come together, how they all intersect to shape their experiences.
So it's about recognizing that people don't just experience one kind of oppression in isolation.
Exactly. Oppression is complex, It's
Mm.
interconnected, multifaceted, and it's really important to consider how all those different forms of discrimination, how they overlap and how they reinforce each other.
And how does this concept of intersectionality relate to the stories of Singul and Sandra?
Well, both women experience multiple forms of oppression. They were women living in societies that were patriarchal, they were immigrants dealing with all the cultural differences, and they were also part of a minority group facing prejudice and discrimination.
So they weren't just dealing with oppression because of their gender. It was also because of their ethnicity and their immigration status and their social class.
That's right. And that's why it's so important to look at these narratives through an intersectional lens, to consider all of those complexities, all of those different systems of oppression they were dealing with.
So we need to look at the whole picture, not just focus on one aspect of their experience.
Exactly. And it highlights the need to come up with solutions that address how interconnected all of those different types of oppression are.
Right. We can't just focus on gender equality. We also have to look at racism and xenophobia and all those other kinds of discrimination. It's about creating a more just and equitable society for everyone, no matter their identity or background.
You got it.
Now, these narratives also really highlight the challenges that come with navigating different cultures and all those expectations that come with them. Both Sengul and Sandra talk about being caught between two worlds, trying to balance what they want, their aspirations, with what their families and their communities expect from them.
Yeah, it's like walking this tightrope,
Yeah,
constantly trying to find that balance.
exactly.
Yeah.
And it's a challenge that I think a lot of immigrants face, especially those from cultures that have strong traditions and expectations. It's about finding a way to honor where they came from, their heritage, while also creating a new path for themselves in a new society.
Right. It's about finding their own voice, finding their own sense of who they are amidst all those cultural expectations.
Exactly. And that's not an easy journey. It takes courage, resilience, and a willingness to figure out those complex and sometimes even conflicting values.
Yeah, and it's a journey that deserves our respect and our understanding.
Absolutely. One of those powerful things about these narratives, I think, is how they can create empathy and understanding. They give us a glimpse into the lives of these women who have gone through incredible challenges, and they make us want to connect with their experiences on a human level.
You're right. It's about seeing the world through their eyes, feeling their pain, recognizing their strength.
Exactly. And I think that empathy is so crucial because it breaks down all those barriers. It challenges those stereotypes that are out there, and it creates space for real dialogue, for connection.
Right. It's about moving past judgment and recognizing that shared humanity that connects all of us.
Right.
And that's what makes these narratives so powerful. They have the potential to change people's minds and hearts
Mm.
and to inspire them to actually do something, take action to make things better.
They're like little seeds of hope, you know, planted in that fertile ground of empathy and understanding.
That's a good way to put it. And it's up to all of us to nurture those seeds, to
Right.
try and cultivate a world that is more just and compassionate, a world where every voice matters, where every single person is valued.
Well said. I also think that these narratives can help us understand how power and control work within families and communities. They show how patriarchy and those traditional gender roles, they can create this hierarchy of power within a family structure.
Right.
And that often makes women vulnerable to abuse and exploitation.
It's like this invisible web, a web of obligations and expectations that can trap women in harmful situations.
Right. And a lot of times, those power dynamics, they're strengthened, they're reinforced by cultural norms and religious beliefs.
Yeah.
So it becomes this really complicated mix of what society expects, personal beliefs, and the choices that individuals make.
It does. And understanding those power dynamics is crucial if we really want to address honor violence effectively.
We have to challenge those structures, the ones that allow people to abuse their power. And we have to give women the power to assert their own rights and their autonomy.
Absolutely. It's about creating a culture where respect and equality are the foundation, a culture where everyone has value and their rights are protected.
Now, there's an aspect of this topic that often gets overlooked in these discussions, and that's the role of men.
Yeah, that's an important one. It's vital to remember that men are not all the same. They play a variety of roles when it comes to honor violence, some in perpetuating it and some in challenging it.
Right. So there are men who are the abusers, but there are also men who are allies, men who are advocates and protectors.
Exactly. And it's so important to recognize that men's experiences and perspectives are diverse. We need to include men in these conversations about honor violence, challenge those harmful ideas about masculinity, and show people some positive examples, positive models of what it means to be a man.
Right. Men have a huge role to play in dismantling the systems that allow violence against women to continue.
Absolutely. And it's about recognizing that gender equality, it's not just a women's issue, it's a human rights issue that affects everyone.
Well said. These narratives also have important implications for those who are working to address honor violence, policymakers and practitioners. How can these stories actually inform their work?
Well, these stories give us a really valuable look into what victims have experienced, the challenges they face, the obstacles they come up against when they're just trying to get help.
So it can help policymakers and practitioners see the issue from the ground level, from the perspective of someone who has actually gone through it.
Yeah, they can be used to create more effective policies and programs and interventions.
For example, if they understand how powerful shame and stigma can be, they can create outreach programs that are culturally sensitive.
Right. And understanding intersectionality can help them develop services that meet the unique needs of different communities.
It's about finding solutions that are tailored to the specific realities of those who have been affected by honor violence.
Exactly. And about making sure those services are accessible, that they're culturally appropriate, and trauma-informed.
Now, I'm also curious to hear your thoughts on the media's role in shaping public perception of this issue.
The media has a lot of power. I mean, it really influences how people talk about things, and it's so important that the way the media covers honor violence is nuanced and accurate and responsible.
Right. We have to avoid sensationalism, avoid those narratives that are too simplistic.
We do. And we have to go beyond just framing honor violence as a cultural problem.
Right. It's about highlighting all those systemic factors, the power dynamics, the broader context of violence against women.
That's right. And it's about making sure that the voices of survivors and advocates are heard.
So it's about telling the story in a way that actually empowers people, a way that informs and inspires action.
Absolutely. And speaking of action, I want to emphasize how important prevention is. We can't just focus on reacting to honor violence after it's happened.
Yeah, you're right. We need to be proactive about addressing those root causes and working to create a culture that rejects all forms of violence against women.
And that means education, raising awareness, and challenging all those harmful gender norms that are out there.
So we're talking about teaching young people about healthy relationships, consent, and respect for all individuals.
Exactly. And it's about working to build a society where women are valued and empowered, where they don't have to live under the threat of violence.
Well said. This has been a really heavy topic, but I want to end on a hopeful note.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, honor violence is a serious issue, but there are people out there, dedicated people, organizations that are working so hard to address it.
Yeah, there are survivors who are sharing their stories, inspiring change.
Right. And there are whole communities coming together to challenge these harmful traditions, to try and build a world that's safer and more just.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's challenging, but progress is being made.
Right. It's a journey, and we all have a responsibility to keep pushing forward.
Absolutely.
We have to demand justice, never give up on the fight for equality.
That's right. That's right.
We have to demand justice, never give up on the fight for equality.
I agree. And that brings us to a point that I think is so important to emphasize, and that's the power of these personal narratives. They really are much more than just stories. They're tools that we can use to raise awareness, create empathy, and even dismantle harmful systems.
Right. They have the potential to spark conversations, challenge our assumptions, and really push for some positive change.
Absolutely. And they remind us that each of us has a story. And those stories have this incredible power to impact the world around us.
Right, right. And while these stories are powerful, it's crucial to remember that they don't represent the full spectrum of experiences with honor violence. We need to listen with empathy, but also engage critically.
Exactly. And our responsibility doesn't stop at just listening. We need to actively challenge the structures that perpetuate violence against women, advocate for policies that promote real gender equality, and really work to create a culture of respect and safety for everyone.
It's about moving beyond words and taking those concrete steps to create a world that is more just and equitable.
I agree.
Well, I think this has been a really powerful conversation, and I know it's a heavy topic. But I'm hopeful that by shedding light on these narratives, we can contribute to a deeper understanding of this complex issue.
Yeah.
An understanding that can hopefully lead to meaningful change.
Yeah, I agree. It's about starting conversations, challenging assumptions, and working together to create a world where everyone feels safe and respected.
So to our listeners, we want to leave you with a thought. What narratives have shaped your understanding of the world? And what role can you play in making sure that those narratives, especially the ones that challenge injustice, are not just heard, but really, truly understood?
Keep questioning, keep learning, and most importantly, keep using your voice to advocate for a more just and equitable world for everyone.
That's a powerful way to wrap up our deep dives today. Thanks so much for joining us on this journey. We'll be back soon with another exploration of a thought-provoking topic.
Until then, keep those conversations going.